Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's Cornerstone webinar. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as the Program Officer for National Leadership in Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our webinar series which equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. Unfortunately, Dr. Watkins is unable to join us, so today's conversation will be moderated by my colleague, Javon Hackley, who serves as the Director of Communications here at Community Progress. Before turning it over to Javon to kick off the conversation, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar browser and type your question into the Q&A box. We will share a video recording from today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send us a message by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of the browser or by sending an email to Justin Goddard at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. Finally, Community Progress has created a COVID-19 resource center, which can be accessed on our website and provides resources and weekly updates for neighborhoods looking to prevent vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration related to the current economic and health challenges. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Javon.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. Before we jump in, I just want to thank everyone, including our panelists, for joining today. In the words of one of our panelists, these conversations are critical right now, even when there's a war outside. And while we're all professionals and practitioners and leaders, I want to acknowledge that we're first human, and that doesn't make us immune to what's happening outside in that war. And many of us are struggling today with the news of related to the murder of Breonna Taylor. And while we might be disappointed in some of the results of yesterday's conversation, they are what make today's dialogue and dialogues like this one even more critical, even more important. And so I want to encourage you all to, share your thoughts, share your questions for the presenters related to racial equity, related to the future of communities in the chat as we move through today's discussion. We've got a few questions that we've preempted, but we do want to invite you to share your thoughts, and we're hoping to make this a dialogue. With that, I will introduce my panelists today who've joined us and shared their time, and thank them. The first is Christopher Coase, who's the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, who's a nationally recognized leader in leveraging policy, the private sector, and community assets to build equitable, sustainable communities. For the last 10 years, he's led SGA's efforts in the built environment, including the Locust Program for Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors, the National Brownfields Coalition, and TOD Finance and Advisors, Inc., and for-profit subsidiary of Smart Growth America. That subsidiary, just to kind of note and give a little shout out there, has resulted in major policy victories, including securing $20 billion in new transit-oriented development and local infrastructure and financing, and the reauthorization of EPA's Brownfields program. So thank you for joining us, Chris. Next, we have Brandy Mack, who is a community liaison at Designing Justice Designing Spaces, an Oakland-based architecture and real estate development nonprofit working to end mass incarceration by building infrastructure that addresses its root causes: poverty, racism, and the criminal justice system itself. She is a holistic health educator, a permaculture designer, and motivational speaker. And for those of you who don't know, I would encourage you to follow him in every way that you can. Alan Malik, our senior fellow here at Community Progress, was nationally known for his work on housing, economic development, and urban revitalization. And he's worked with local governments and communities across the country to develop creative policies and strategies to rebuild cities and neighborhoods. So a dynamic speaker set here. If you're looking to follow these folks online, you can follow Christopher at Christopher Coase on Twitter. I would encourage you to join us and follow us at Community Progress, Seek Progress News on Twitter. And then we have, for tracking Brandy, the best way to follow her is going to be on Instagram, and it is Be Holistic, Be Healthy. That's the letter B there. So thank you all panelists for joining us this morning. And just to do a quick sound check, can you all just say hello to the crowd to make sure that we've got everybody plugged in?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh. Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Great. Awesome. All right, to shift in here, we know that the issues affecting our communities are diverse and deep, and COVID-19 has put many of them on display. And we've got plenty of theories floating out there about COVID-19 and its impact on cities, rural areas and communities. Some say that COVID-19 is going to be the beginning of a mass exodus of people and businesses away from cities over the next decade. Others argue that dense urban places have played only a small role in COVID-19 outside of the local government action and response. And the best indicators as to whether a person contracts the virus is whether they live on the good or bad side of town. Now, we'll acknowledge today that it's just an hour of conversation, and there's so much that we don't know about what's ahead for the future of cities. But our hope is that through our dialogue, we'll be able to elevate questions and concerns that you as practitioners should have on your mind as you're navigating COVID-19 and your response, and to hear and highlight some of the innovative solutions and work that was happening pre-COVID-19 that puts us into the space of leveraging the insights we've got to respond to yet another crisis. And we say crises on one side, but the biggest acknowledgement that I want to make to start us off is that we've got a crisis happening, and we've had American crises before, and each of these presents an opportunity to transform communities either in a positive or negative way. And a lot of that transformation is built on how we respond and what we will do. And so with that, I'm going to shift my first question toward Alan Malik here. And Alan, we're about 6 months into the crises. And just to kind of set the stage, what are some of the trends we're seeing in our cities? And how are vulnerable people in communities being affected by the crisis economically?
Okay, well, thanks, Javon. And I think it's a really tough picture. We're 6 months into it, but it's still in midstream, and we still don't know how a lot of it's going to sort out. We know that the whole economy took a huge nosedive at first, and now it's starting to come back. Maybe not as fast as some people want, but it is starting to come back, but it's coming back unevenly. And it's the classic problem with the US economy. The stronger areas, the richer people, the more successful communities, however you define it, are coming back a lot faster than the less affluent, less successful communities. A place like Washington, D.C., for example, is coming back a lot faster than Cleveland. And in the cities, and this is the crux of the issue, because we could easily see a rerun of what happened after the foreclosure crisis here, is the stronger neighborhoods, the more affluent areas are coming back faster. One thing that's amazing is the real estate market, particularly in strong neighborhoods, has bounced back amazingly. But at the same time, in low-income communities, in communities of color, there's still a huge lag. Unemployment, for example, unemployment among white people has dropped from its peak back in the spring much faster than unemployment in the African-American communities. So vulnerable people, vulnerable communities are being hit hardest. And whether we're talking about unemployment, we're talking about small businesses closing, we're talking about low-income people being unable to make their rent and staying in their homes for the time being because of the moratoria, but eventually something has got to give. And at the same time, I've just seen some recent numbers that small landlords, particularly African-American and Latinx small landlords, are really hurting because they operate on a thin edge to begin with and can't carry the tenants who can't pay the rent without a struggle. So we're seeing a whole series of things that, depending on how they play out over the next year, could either mean, if we have the right kind of federal action and the right kind of community activities, we could come out of this well. If we don't, we could end up with problems far more serious than we're currently seeing, and a long-term continued decline for vulnerable communities. So it's a really tough.
Alan, you talk a little bit about the thin edge, right? And a couple of other fixed factors. The uneven rebound we're seeing in some areas, is that all due to pre-existing frameworks, or do you think there's something new driving the uneven response or recovery?
I think it's mostly pre-existing frameworks. But I mean, we do know, though, that the pandemic itself has hit vulnerable communities, African Americans and Latinx people, harder than other communities. So that's been added on top of an existing inequitable, uneven framework. So, you know, if you have an uneven playing field and then they come in there, you know, and dig another trench in it, it's going to be that much more uneven. Another problem is the fact that, and I saw some numbers just this morning, you know, people who have college, 60% of people with college degrees are now doing telework, working remotely. 15% of people with a high school degree or less are doing telework. That, and again, so everything about the crisis we're in exacerbates the pre-existing inequities in the system.
Yeah, and I know I'm not the only one on the call who says, okay, I think that some of this has already been on our minds and we get this. I'll start with Chris with this next question, but we know the frameworks, we know some of the pre-existing conditions, we're seeing the responses here 6 months in. What should we be thinking about for those of us who are concerned with real recovery and infusing equity into that recovery? I'll start with you, Chris, there. And you are on mute.
Thank you. And again, thank you to the Center for inviting me to be a part of this very important and timely discussion. To be honest with you, COVID-19, much like Alan mentioned, only revealed what was happening and it's only accelerated. But also, COVID-19, in terms of a public health crisis, we're in a racial crisis. We have been in an economic crisis, as Alan pointed out, for decades. And in what we can't also ignore is that we are in a climate crisis too. These things put together, these four things put together, public health, race, economic, climate, has crashed the American operating system, right? And in many ways, if you're sitting in your computer and it's constantly crashing, you know it's time to upgrade, right? And with that, these meta issues really creates this unique, once in a generation opportunity for us, those of us who are practitioners, and for me, who works with the private sector, with local municipalities and federal policymakers, of how do we address this moment in time? And there are four things I think we as practitioners need to consider as to ensure that when we look back 20 years from now, we can say that we created a more equitable, just, and healthy society. First thing, we need to have a radical reimagination of what the heck we're doing. We need to have a radical reimagination of what the American dream is. What is the American vision? If you talk about what happened yesterday or all the stories of the unknown names or names that we don't know, we have to create a society where we can have all voices at the table and we can move forward. And that means allowing and accepting and building spaces for that conversation to happen. And I'll be honest with you, when we talk about equitable cities and communities today, I'll tell you from a research perspective, based on some of the research we've done at Smart Growth America in conjunction with the George Washington University School of Business, equitable cities, places with great high quality of amenities and resource and health resources and cultural aspects are going through the roof. Alan pointed out places like DC, places like in parts of Brooklyn, but this is not just big city. It's also happening in smaller tier markets as well that have the ability to bring these things together. Interesting enough, the question becomes, can we not only protect those places that are inclusive, walkable, and equitable today, but can we create more? Because as Alan pointed out, there's a fierce competition for those of us who are lower income and middle income to get into those places, because we know the places that we may be in may not put us in the best position for the 21st century. So it really forces us to have a radical reimagination of what it means to have an American operating system that ensures that everyone, no matter who you are or where you live in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And the second thing I would say in terms of framing that we have to consider as we approach policy and even engagement amongst the ecosystem is recognizing that we can't talk about these issues, race, climate, public health, and economic inclusion, without recognizing that they're all connected. There's a level of intersectionality. Some communities, housing affordability is a transportation solution. right? I know many communities where individuals are spending over half, if not 2 times what they normally would spend on federal and state taxes on just housing and transportation, right? You can't talk about the fact that Black American millennials who are, as Alan pointed out, may be college educated, over 1 million of them across the country, even in the DC market where I currently live, over 160,000 of them are mortgage ready, but cannot afford to buy a home in the place they are calling home. So in many ways, you're forcing individuals to go out to where the most affordable housing is, which is out in the drivable suburbs, but that's also the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can't have these conversations in silos. And that's not just policies either. That's also in our ecosystem of policy advocates. Housing community is a climate solution. Environmental community recognizes a transportation solution. The racial inequities is all of our shit. So we have to come in terms of intersectionality versus competition. The third thing I would say is there is a fundamental question as we think of how we create equitable communities for the future. Who's building it? Who's benefited from it? If we look and fast forward, the last major element of where the American economy had major structural changes, we think about World War II, the federal government, followed by the state and local government, put enormous resources to build the new middle class and a new future. That intervention, billions and billions and billions of dollars, helped create one of the most wealthiest generation of our lifetime. And we're still paying benefits for that. The question is, that was done for certain groups of people. What we need to do as part of that reimagination, that intersectionality, we have to ask ourselves, how can we allow those individuals who are left behind to be first in line? Because again, the radical reimagination of the future of America has to be that 25 years from now, everybody, Black Americans, communities of color, those who have been long disadvantaged, are the actual builders of communities that are equitable and communities of opportunity. And the last thing I'll tell you, and I think I'll share in terms of the framing of when we think about creating equitable communities, talking about policy, talking about movement building, if yesterday didn't tell us anything, we have to be bolder and we have to try different things. We have to get out of our shells. There's no silver bullet, but it's going to require all of us, communities of color, practitioners, our white allies, and even those who we don't even know are allies that we got to bring over, kicking and shoving, that we have to be bolder in the movement building. And I think through those 4 framing, I think we can now, in many ways, look 25 years from now and take advantage of all the billions of dollars that's coming out of the federal government. We have a transportation bill, we have a climate bill, we have a potential COVID-19 bill coming after this election, we have a new election. We are in a moment where the soil is being toiled. And now is the time for us to plant those seeds. So that's how I view, those are my elements. And again, as I said, I think this is the moment that we have been waiting for.
Now, I know a lot of us recognize, Chris, and thank you for highlighting it, the potency of this moment, right? Like what we're all dealing with, and the fact that there are returns and a future we're trying to architect that is 25 years down the road. But I've got to pull in Brandy to the conversation now, as somebody who represents a racial equity organization doing transformative work on the ground, that it's, we know, going to have generations of impact. But, Brandy, I've got to ask you, what are some of the ways we're talking about this radical reimagination and intersectionality and what this looks like on the ground? What are some of the ways that communities can actively, tactically, practically put equity as a centerpiece to make sure that we're not just, transforming or creating headlines, sound bites, and tweets, but actually putting us ahead, and when we look back in 25 years, going to put us in the right seat? How does your organization see that, and what examples are you seeing on the ground of this actually working successfully, or at least successful attempts, if you will?
Thank you so much, Javon and Christopher and Alan. I appreciate just sitting in this space, and I just want to give thanks to my ancestors, the reason why I'm even able to be here, allowing us to have this conversation. And it's just so important, Christopher, you said something that I want us to remember throughout, is that it's going to take a whole ecosystem. It's not a siloed piece, and we are all connected, each person and that what we believe and value with designing justice, designing spaces, is that it's a first internal job individually to begin to think about what does it really look like to restore and deal with the isms that have been like passed down through generations. That it's not an outward job, it's an inward job. And as abolitionists, you all can see the background. We don't build better prisons. In fact, we are working with our policymakers to look at what does it look like in our code of ethics as architects and builders to make sure that our other fellow colleagues are not building cages. We believe that is inhumane, and it upholds the built environment that has supported racism to thrive within our country for so many years. Understand that the built environment has contributed to the racism and the inequity that we see in a very visceral way. It is our intention to use our technical knowledge and skill to unbuild racism with the built environment that started with 400 years ago when we had slavery, went into sharecropping, right? We were promised 4 acres and a mule. That didn't happen. Then we watched white flight go on, Jim Crow, and we must think, as I often will say, Sankofa, that when we think equity, it doesn't mean a brand new shiny thing, but it may be go back and fetch it because it was already happening. And when you ask me, Javon, concrete work, we work and serve at the intersections of policy, program, and places. See, often in our communities, we're stuck on one piece. And again, Christopher, you really set me up because it's an ecosystem. We were talking earlier, you all, but you weren't on it about a good gumbo roux. Like in order to make a real good, a good pot of gumbo, the roux has to be good, meaning there's all these elements that have to go in there and the ingredients have to be key. And we can't fall back on the easier. It's a long process. Y'all know that gumbo cooks for a long time. It's not a quick fix. We've had the opportunity to radically reimagine. So I give thanks, Javon, like the on the ground, as we have policy folks who are going, what's happening in our community, where we all of a sudden walk outside and we see a beer crawl in the block, and we had no idea that the beer crawl was existing in this parking lot because we have no knowledge about the policy of vacant lots in our community. But our air quality is horrible, and so we have a group over here working on air quality. So we like to talk about placekeeping. And be mindful of some of the heavy words that we're using in this society around, they're blanket words, equity, and it feels really good, like justice. I often challenge and say sovereignty. So this means our ability to be able to own, process, and distribute our wealth and healing within our community. And so as we've had the opportunity so far to work with our beloved community organizers, which again, this intersection is important. We know our place as technical support. And then we also know that our folks on the front line have been fighting policies day in and day night, but not often thinking about the built environment, right? In nonprofit and policy world, you'll hear comments like, we could do it in a broom closet. All we need is a chair and a desk. Not thinking about how the place really matters. Place matters. And we have to move forward. Recently, we worked in Atlanta, Georgia with Women on the Rise. And they are an amazing group of Black women who have been formerly incarcerated, who have pushed policy to close down the Atlanta City Jail. They were successful. This is 5 years of boots on the ground or more, and more than 5, because Marilyn Wynn, the amazing Black woman who heads up the organization, spent a big part of her life incarcerated. And as we recognize that the systems that were designed to upbuild racism, not for healing, but to upbuild racism, need to come down, it is important that we support our community organizers who are saying, shut them down. So Women on the Rise was successful in Atlanta with Mayor Keisha Bottoms and got her ear to the point where she put together a task force in the city of Atlanta, filled with community organizers who serve their communities directly through every district, to begin to radically reimagine. Christopher, you said this, what does it look like if we shut down the Atlanta jail that's only servicing 30 humans, but costing the city over $3 million a year to operate, you hear? So folks are not even in there needed. But what would it look like if we actually replace this jail with a center of equity that we know is what's needed in order for community to have what some could say a level playing field within community? So we spent over a year working in the city of Atlanta with Mayor Keisha Bottoms, Women on the Rise, several other key organizers who have been pushing policy, unraveling this crazy carceral system that has been designed again. And if you haven't had a chance, please go visit Brian Stevenson's museum, the Lynch Museum. He gives you a very great picture from slavery to penitentiary, that this was a design, that we're not in a, oh God, how did this happen? This was a design, again, to uphold and uphold racism in the built environment. And so as we worked for a year in Atlanta, Georgia, we were able to produce 3 different designs that the community could look at, decide on, and this was done with the community. Let me go here. That even as we push in our architectural world that knows how to build, and we know better, and we're in this prescription, we recognize that the community knows the best for the community. The community has made it through riots and wars. They have been rebelled against and resisted the system, and we're still here. Even with our verdict yesterday, we are still here. We go nowhere. And so as they began to work with this task force for a year, we went out to the community and said, what's really needed here instead of a jail? We were able to produce 3 different models. And can I tell you, the model that most folks wanted was like, let's tear it down and build something new. What does it look like to create distributed care models throughout the city, within the communities who have, like you would say, Christopher, vacant lots, but as we see, as placekeeping. What was there? That if we go back and look at our picture within our transportation departments, again, it's unfortunate that our country has been plagued with racism as it's made its decisions. Its decisions weren't made for the holistic component of everyone. It was made out of fear. It was made out of fear. If you should get to this level, then what will I have? So as we moved out of slavery and went into sharecropping, right? That was scary. We literally said that for 400 years, you were able to build your wealth with no anything. And now you have to share. Then we went into Jim Crow. Let's think about that era. So here's what I'm asserting and what we're saying. We're abolitionists. We don't want to build a better jail or a nicer Starbucks. We know that the community has the answers for the community. As we begin to work at all those intersections of people, place, and program, that together we have to begin to imagine those spaces that have been abandoned and look at them as assets, because they are. And part of our design within our infrastructure in our cities has given us the lens of disparity versus the lens of, wait, there's an asset in my community. That this time that we're dealing with, especially as the exodus happens, right? We're talking about folks going back into second city. What does it look like for folks who've been living in that city, who've been trying to get to the city, right? You're like, folks like, wait a minute, now all the city folks are coming to my community. So wait a minute, here's a good opportunity for a gumbo, actually. What happens when good thought leaders and local folks get together to reimagine what can happen there? That this isn't a disparity moment. This actually is a time for us to get together, circle up, as we say, in our team, and began to imagine some of the corridors that need to be recreated, y'all. This ain't new. That's the other thing. So when we think about American history, there's so much of it. We have whole cities in Brooklyn that were buried, that folks are finding, that were literally buried. So folks wouldn't know that folks were thriving and living in a safe place. That was intentional. So as we uncover and begin to reimagine, it's going to require us to do a little Sankofa. It's not a whole brand new thing. So we're very mindful as developers and architects that we are not we're coming here to show you, and this is brand new. In fact, we want to help uncover the dust of the buried designs that were there to help people thrive many moons ago. But unfortunately, based on our pedagogy of racism in America, they were intentionally covered. And so when we think about radical imagination, it starts right with the community, the folks who are in community. But like you said, Christopher, they're so intentional. As a biomimic designer, I mimic Mama Nature, and we all stand on her. And if we all don't realize that racism was a collective trauma, it is a collective trauma. It is not, oh, the poor Blacks are coming from this empathy, that everyone's jacked up. You can't breathe right now. So you wanting to put that freeway through redlining is jacking you up too. There's no silo in this. We all are accountable. And if you should want, and I'll leave with this, as a mother, my work is thinking about the next generations. I don't stand here on a soapbox like, oh, because I know that some of this I won't see in my generation. But what I have to know is that I'm going to keep my energy towards that, because they deserve fresh air, clean water, because this is where we're getting to as we continue to move in haste. It's only going to equal waste.
Amen.
Well, and you sort of pulled, my boss, Akilah Watkins, couldn't be with us today, but you pulled Dr. Watkins into the conversation because she has this regular dialogue around by the time something's on the plate. So I love our gumbo analogy. You know, you missed your opportunity to correct it and to correct the experience. You can put some salt and pepper on a bad dish, but really what we need to think about is what was happening in the kitchen that got us to this point. And if we're really trying to serve or change what people are being served up and what community's eating, we got to fix it at its root. And so with that, I'll just open this to all of you. I know we talked about this, you know, in our prep calls, but where have been the past recovery pitfalls? Chris, you talked about World War II. You know, Brandy, you talked about systems and decisions over time. But if we're thinking about spaces where we've gotten it wrong in the past, that we have the opportunity with an economic adjustment, with folks, you know, sort of changing the way they work, they live, where are the spots that we've seen pitfalls in the past that we need to pay attention to get us forward?
Well, I'll just throw out a couple of things. I think we all know that after World War II, the investment was focused on the white community and left a lot of people out of the picture. But more recently, I think what happened after the foreclosure crisis and the fact that the federal government never really stepped in and took control of the situation meant that when the recovery started to happen, the strong areas, the stronger markets, the more affluent people came back strong. The areas that were less affluent remained at the bottom. And even today, you know, we're looking at something that happened 12 years ago. You can go into almost any city in this country and see how certain areas came back strong, other areas that fell down by the same amount at that time have never come back. And so I think the one thing we know, the default system in America, the default setting of what Christopher referred to as the American operating system, is based on increasing inequality. And the only way we can change that is by consciously and intentionally coming up with the policies that are going to shift the game fundamentally. And I think when we're talking about physical environments in cities, I mean, that starts right with the question of how are low-income tenants and the often just a step above low-income landlords who house an awful lot of them, how are they going to come out of this hole so we don't have massive abandonment, loss of value, people ending up on the streets? And I think, you know, one of the things that I think is just unbelievably frustrating to me is the fact this calls out for a federal response. And we got a good bill from Sherrod Brown in the House, and it died there. And so that, I mean, that's only one of many issues. But the whole question of how do we treat tenants and small landlords and keep them from falling further and further behind is just one of many issues that we're going to have to confront, and hopefully will after January.
Alan, I just want to say, yeah, I just want to say ditto to that. And, you know, even just bringing it to what's happened in the last, you know, couple of days, you know, beyond the Breonna Taylor, you know, many of us woke up to the CEO of Wells Fargo making a comment over on the lines of like, hey, I can't find any Black talent, full stop. Turns out one of the major failures of both post-Great Recession and even during what we're seeing now in terms of response to COVID-19 is this inherent belief that this top-down approach, this old operating system is the only way to actually help other individuals who are not part of your system. For example, when you think about COVID-19 and we talk about the PPP program, which was supposed to be, the largest, infusion of direct capital to American businesses, the fact of the matter is before we even talk about communities of color, the fact of the matter is that our system was not designed, it's so outdated that we don't know all the businesses, that we can't get checks to people quickly, that we do not have, as a nation, a infrastructure with all of the proudness and all of the technological supremacy that we have, that even the most basic thing, providing resources in a time of pandemic quickly, even though we can do it, you and I can exchange capital through our phones in a blink of an eye, that we have antiquated systems, one, and then two, that we thought that the existing infrastructure, this outdated infrastructure, was going to help people of color. The fact that now over 60% of small Black and brown businesses are on the verge of going bankrupt, and we're surprised by that, right? But at the same time, you have Black institutions that may not be at the table with big banks, right? But are the heartbeat in the community. You know, I think about this all the time, where I have to ask every time I'm in these meetings on Capitol Hill or in these national or industry discussions. I was like, who is missing? Because I know in places like DC, Detroit, Atlanta, my hometown of Thomasville, Georgia, there are plenty of people like me who's doing the same work. It just so happened they don't have the legacy, the infrastructure that allows them to go at scale at the mega $1 billion. However, if we had planted seeds back in 2008 and actually built up a bottom-up approach of how can we create more financial institutions that's no longer based on old systems, but recognize that we have a technological revolution happening that allows exchange of capital to happen both from an institutional standpoint, but also from micro-lending. If we had planted those seeds after the Great Recession in 2008, imagine what we could have had today. And that's what I mean to you. You asked a variable point, a key point of what have been some of the lessons we've learned. And one of the main lessons is we had to invest at the ground level. And those investments will pay dividends. I give a final example, opportunity zones. I'm known to talk about opportunity zones. I think it's one of those things that has a radical reimagination. It unlocks a lot of capital. But one of the inherent things, but
for what?
But I would say before I even get to for what, I would give the policy principle is to drive investment away from where it's safe, where the risk profile is such that people can make their returns, and go in these low-income communities. I did the research. I looked at all the opportunities. I even overlaid, here's where the market is going, here's where business wants to go. Now, which of these opportunity zones meet that threshold? Out of the 8,700 opportunity zones, based on the research, less than 3% met the market investment readiness for opportunity zone investment. And even when you overlay what has happened, we confirm that. But here's the flip side of that. When you look at the capital that we're trying to create, it ignores the capital that's already there, right? Why are we not, that mom and pop business has been supported not by big banks or unrealized capitals. It's been by that church. It's been by that grandma. It's been by the community. So why are we not rethinking our tax structure that says, hey, Christopher, and we all saw this. How many of you on this call have seen the GoFundMe? Please save this business that's been in our community for 60 years. We're going to set up a GoFundMe account, raise $50,000 or $100,000. Did you get a tax benefit from that? Did you get any revenue from that from the federal government? But no, someone said, someone who's investing in Google, or actually someone said, banks who's getting free money from the government, loaning out to others with no risk, because the government's backing it, are allowed to charge fees on free money to you and me. Again, these are the errors of our policy making. And unfortunately, what we have to demand from the grassroots all the way to the federal level is that those who are making policy need to open that door and let some more individuals in that room who look like you and me and the communities that we represent to be part of that reimagination of politics. Unfortunately, the old operating system keeps crashing, and I ain't got time looking at the spiral. I'm trying to build a future where my children and their children are having the time of their lives, and they can talk about something else, right? And I think that's the challenge. And I think we have to, as a coalition of ecosystem, we had to demand something different.
Well, you talked about ecosystem, Chris, and I like that you highlighted opportunity zone, but there's a challenge that I always have when I hear about opportunity zones and the conversation, because the headlines are just so big. But, I'm not in permaculture, so Brandy, jump in and pick up where I get it wrong. But Mother Nature's never growing one solution at a time. There is a strategy for growth that requires some diversity. And, yes, radical imagination, while the software company's working on the operating system, somebody is working on the app that's going to fit the operating system. But I'd love to know, Brandy, you've got some true insight into equity programming, what that looks like when it's localized. I think Alan's acknowledgement of the limits of the federal system and infrastructure to even see who needs to be helped. But if we're talking about capitalizing on what's happening on the ground, what should we be paying attention to if we're going to invest in something? If Chris gets his way and we've got the investment coming, where's it going, Brandy? Like what on the ground are we actually nurturing in this phase?
Thank you. When we think about on the ground, I want to think about the soil and what's holding us up. Because when we think about ground, it's the foundation. And it's such a trip how we often go there last, right? But you couldn't stand if you didn't have foundation, meaning these systems that we're dealing with could not exist if they didn't have this foundation to stand on. We work from 3 different buckets with designing justice, designing space. And one of the buckets, as I hear Chris, is the restorative reinvestment is what we're saying. That as developers and architects, we've shifted out of this design of traditional development, where a project that we are now sparking in Detroit, the Love Campus, which came out of our work with Allied Media's Love Building development, recognizing that the Love Building couldn't hold everything that they wanted to love on as far as justice work. The Love Building is a building where Allied Media, Detroit Justice Center, Detroit Disability will be housed to support their supporters. But they said, what does justice look like? Does it look like sitting at a desk, or does it look like having a movie theater we can run small films? Does it look like having a meditation spa? What does justice really look like? So as we began to open up radical imagination with Allied Media, we said, look, y'all don't have space in this building for what you're trying to see. We need to go a little bit deeper. And there's these lots next door that are unfortunately vacant. But if one were to go look like we did in our homework, this used to be a thriving community on 14th and Grand River in Detroit, where Black bottoming community existed. I just want to keep talking about that was like layered and no longer there. So what's remnants is this Love Building. Well, if we're going to rebuild, then we again need to go back and Sankofa and go, folks were there, not even with recognition, right? Like the zoning wasn't even recognized as this being a whole community. So here we have to go there. So as we think about developing this Love Campus, our thought process is not just how you get to a performer, but can the community own this Love Campus? What are the designs that we have set up where we can have micro lending and all the folks being able to invest in this space? And what policies that we have now that don't even allow you to play in the game? You can't even hang in the game. It's set up to where you can't even jump in. So how are we creating these sorts of developments? And that's what we're talking about, restorative reinvestment. Right? Like folks are there. How do we allow them to get in? And as you said, Mother Nature never produces one solution. Part of our issue is we're trying to be linear versus circular. Also, what Mother Nature doesn't do is compete. I have to acknowledge that. The human design competed in nature, and I'm studying it in depth, you all. We have prey and predator, right? But we don't have competition. That is not a design within the system of nature. So as humans who are fairly a new organism, so to speak, in the whole scheme of things, being that Mother Earth has been around 3.8 billion years, we need to think a little bit deeper on how our design is. And if we don't go back to that original pattern that Chris keeps talking about and go, why are we still going top down? When we know that if you don't build the foundation of a house, it's not going to stand. Mm-hmm. It's the 2 things you look for. And we're not saying we can leave the roof out, right? Because you need the roof and the shoes to be great. And then everything in the middle for it to operate. So like, how are we designing? And so with us, we are a nonprofit looking to be a hyper tax business to be able to allow our community to be able to invest in our developments, that we're also going, hey, community, we know you here. We don't have this brand new idea, but we want y'all to know it costs to operate this development, and we want you to be able to be in it. What does that look like? So we're talking about spacing and planning and talking about dollars as we're engaging with community around development. And what is this opportunity zone that we talk about and hear about? The community, it just goes right over often like, what do you mean? And we're on the tail end fighting. We're doing a whole thing. We like, y'all, here's the design. And so I want to go back to what are we patterning our design on as we talk about radical imagination and being mindful that our folks have been so depleted and extracted, just like Mama Nature, y'all, this is one in a hand, that if you've been extracted so much, what fertilizers, what amendments do we need to put back into community so that the soil can then produce a deeper fruit? And so when we talk about our federal funding going to banks and all the channels that I just have to keep highlighting, you all, they were not created but to uphold racism. These designs were not created thinking of the whole system at all. It was out of fear. And what we know is that when you're designing out of fear, it's normally not gonna stay. It's breaking down right in front of our eyes. Our air quality, our planet is breaking down in front of our eyes. And so if we don't circle up, and I'll just keep saying that and recognize that that this bottom up that we keep saying, and we have lofty words, you know, tons of lofty words to describe community. And if we don't recognize like mycelium, AKA mushrooms, we all connected. So you thinking you're not connected to me, and we're gonna see this pandemic is showing that dynamic, that you can't just run away and say another day. You are connected to this. And I'll just say this, it is a collective trauma. It is not just affecting colored folks. And so I want us to just be mindful there and think about what is restorative reinvestment coming from our policymakers, from our federal government. It has to happen. And we can't keep top down like, I don't know, like Christopher said, we can't find any educated colored folks. Our lens must shift. We got to pour the Visine deeper in the eyes.
All right, so the lens must shift. I want to invite everyone that's participating in the webinar to go to the bottom of your screen and click the chat bubble and send to all panelists your questions for the panelists as we sort of transition here and meditate on that big question. So we would love to know what you need to know, need help with, what can we provide insight with there on the ground. But before we get to those panelist questions, I do have to queue up. We've, you know, talked about systems, we've talked about agenda, we've talked about a reframe for each of the panelists. If we're going to put something new on the community's agenda or on the mind of those that are planning for 2021 and what their communities look like in terms of support, what's the issue that needs to be brought to the table that hasn't had enough attention in your view? And I know that's a broad question, but for the practitioners at the state level, local level on the ground, and even maybe the federal response, where are the new questions that will take us outside of the wall and discovering the opportunities and the lots or whatever the new opportunity is? What should communities be considering or what should be on their minds? And don't all rush in at once, I know.
Well, I'll throw out one thing. I think, you know, when you look at local government and state government, I'll just sort of take that as one particular batch. I mean, what they really have to do, and I think both Brandy and Christopher have kind of alluded to this, is just take a big step back. You know, we don't appreciate how much money local governments and state governments actually spend on all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And they really have to take a big step back and say, what does that amount to? And how is it impacting communities and people? And maybe start with the money that's explicitly designed to go in that direction, like community development money or economic development money. But they've got to look broadly at how do we spend money on transportation, on highways, on public works? What do we fix? What do we let slide? How do we spend money on, put a big one, on incarceration? We're spending billions on that. How do we, and really just, you know, I think if you look at the opportunity zone, which I'm not a fan of by any means, you got to look, that didn't come out of somebody thinking systematically about how can we best improve neighborhoods. It came out of somebody saying, how can we sneak something into a tax bill that's basically horrible that might help a little bit? It was another piece of duct tape on the problem. We're beyond, got to think broadly about how do we change the paradigm for how resources in this country, especially public resources, but also private resources, are spent.
You know, You know, it's funny because Al, you had ended somewhere, and I'm like, gosh, that has to be another webinar because I want to talk about opportunity zones. And I'm going to touch on it a little bit because I actually one of the few people of color who has been a champion for the concept, but also recognizing that it's incomplete because we want people to invest in our communities, but one of the things you can't do is just show up by yourself and assume you're going to do it by yourself, right? Not having technical assistance and capacity building for the communities upon which people are. I want bridge builders. I want white capital. I want Black capital coming to the table with local community groups and elected folks and those who've been left behind and asking, how are we going to make something better? How can we protect our planet? How can we improve our community assets and our people? And also maybe let's make a dollar together. I'm never going to be opposed to that. But what I am opposed to, and I think this is where, Javon, where when you ask, what's the thing that's coming around the corner that we need to be prepared for, is that if we don't have a universal recognition that we're in this together, then we're setting ourselves up for failure as a nation. And here's what I mean by that. And Brandon, I think what you brought up about COVID-19 is really impactful because here's the thing. I look at Americans who are driving an hour and a half to get to work, coming to a realization that they don't want to do that no more, right? Therefore, they change their market dynamics. Although we created a system to allow them to have the American dream, which internally is actually driving until you qualify for a home, which is also the source for some of the climate crisis that we're in right now, right? If we have that paradigm that we're living in, the consequences of our forefathers' decisions are coming home to roost. And it's not just going to affect me as a person of color or my CEO of a major, it's going to affect all of us because from a climate standpoint, we can be having these conversations about how we can do these things. And as Brandy said, these things, the root takes a long time, but someone needs to put some appetizers on the table because when that flood comes and it displaces thousands of your local residents, do you have somewhere where they're going to live, right? If you have wildfires burning out in the West and you're now displacing hundreds of thousands of individuals, where are they going to go? If you have places in the world that's down in our southern hemisphere that's not getting the adequate rain or the drought, and they start going and walking up through the hemisphere to find opportunity, guess what? People, human civilization has shown people are going to come to where they think they can get food, water, and opportunity. And I think, Javon, that is something that frame that if we don't do this together, we are setting ourselves up to be picked apart by forces that we have yet to be seen. And I think that's why I've articulated that when we see these instances, whether it's climate crisis, COVID-19, racial injustice, and inequality, we all realize, as Brandon said, we are all experiencing the symptoms of it, right? Of this sickness and this virus and this dysfunction of crashing of our system. If we all don't want to go to Apple and recognize we need to upgrade our system or get a better PC, then we're all subjecting ourselves to the fact that we no longer would be the country that I think we all want to be, where if you're in a second-tier city, whether you're in a rural place or you're in an urban core, you know you can build a future for your children. And I think that, my friend, is the thing that if you're not on the ground building tables where all of the stakeholders can sit and recognize that we have a vision and an objective, because otherwise, as Brandy said, we're going to fail. If we don't get that right, everything else we're talking about, every man's for himself. Every man and woman is for himself.
Well, I think there's some connectivity between your conversation and Alan's conversation. That's a good thought to sort of wrap up and center on. And that is, you know, that accountability Alan talked about in terms of transparency. You know, that is a really important point for fueling the look forward. We talked about opportunity zones on the call today, but we haven't talked a lot about the Community Reinvestment Act or the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act or land bank legislation or how we're working with or thinking about CLTs and all these other decisions that are being made.
These are tools
underneath the COVID. Yeah, they're underneath the COVID headline, but we can't ignore the responsibility that we have to impact on the ground today and to do the work and to make the decisions. Chris, I think that you're completely right. We've got 4 or 5 comments that say we need an opportunity zone webinar, but I just want to highlight that again in that diverse solutions conversation, you know, Alan's note about understanding where the money is gone there's a lot of federal framework that was supposed to do that we've seen become more vague and more broad, and it's a dangerous trend. And I think that it warrants more conversations, because the future is going to be architected by those who, one, set up the right rails so understanding and transparency can be there.
Yeah.
But, you know, when the federal legislation fails, whether it's the funding partner, whether it's the nonprofit we'll work with, are we owning the responsibility that we all have to actually positively impact on the ground and to imagine the future? There's something I love in terms of how you all own this narrative that we need to share and radiate there. I'm getting my screen change here, so I want to encourage everyone to continue to follow the conversations. So if you're on Twitter, Akilah Watkins Butler is available there, Dr. Akilah W or Dr. Akilah WB, designed to restore for designing justice, designing spaces, at Christopher Coase. So Smart Growth is all over Twitter, everywhere. And for information in the latest and greatest from Alan Malik, we're always tweeting it from See Progress News. With that, Justin, I don't know if we have any time for any additional wrap up, but I'll turn it over to you to sort of guide us out here.
All right, I just want to first say thank you to all of our panelists for a really, really engaging conversation. I think I need to look up my own recipe cards for gumbo at this point. So I'm very, that's going to be something I go do this
Former
afternoon.
Louisiana resident. I went to cooking school there. I can help you, Justin, if you need. This is an extremely, very engaging conversation. I hope that hopefully this can maybe be the beginning of more conversations like this. I also want to say a big thank you to Javon Hackley for moderating today's conversation. I want to thank all of you for participating and being engaged and signing up to participate in today's webinar. If you'd like to get more information on our webinars, please visit our website, and I hope that you all have a great afternoon.